Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to say to my colleagues who are here that I hope that we can stop the politics and really focus on a result that will make a difference for the American people. Hearts were broken across this country, all of us, as we woke up the Sunday before last to the news of the horrific terrorist attack on the nightclub in Orlando that took the lives of 49 innocent people, and 53 more were injured. I can't imagine how their families feel and the pain that their loved ones must be experiencing. Our prayers are with them and those who are wounded, and with our brave first responders who had to go there to address this horrible terrorist attack. This was an attack that shook our nation. It was an attack on our LGBT community in a place where people come together to enjoy themselves, to celebrate who they are. It was an act of terrorism. It was an act of hatred. And this was the worst terrorist attack on our soil since September 11th. It is a somber reminder that, unfortunately, the terrorists that committed this attack, someone who pledged allegiance to the leader of ISIS, someone who unfortunately committed an act of terrorism and an act of hatred. It's a somber reminder that ISIS continues to plan and inspire attacks against us here at home, and that we do have to take this fight to ISIS much more aggressively and to make sure that they don't continue to have the capacity to inspire terrorist attacks against us on our homeland or against our allies around the world that we have seen in other places like Paris and Brussels. We have to defeat radical Islamist terrorists, and we have to destroy ISIS so that they can no longer spread hatred, violence, and death. Unfortunately, the terrorists that committed this horrible attacks in Orlando, he was investigated by our FBI. And during that investigation, he was placed on what is called the selectee list. And that list is part of a larger list, which is sometimes referred to as the terrorism watch list. When an individual goes to purchase a firearm and they are on the terror watch list, the FBI is notified that that purchase is taking place, and they have up to 72 hours to take some action or to further their investigation. But this individual, this horrible terrorist, was taken off the list because the FBI enclosed their investigation. I hope we do not lose sight on this floor of the fact that we better do everything we can to understand any gaps in our intelligence system about that investigation, understand why it was closed, and make sure that investigations like this don't get closed in the future, and that we have a situation where the FBI has the resources and tools that they need to follow up properly when they have someone in their sights like they had this terrorist. But the reality is, had he been on the list like he had been previously, before the investigation was closed, the FBI would have been notified of his firearm purchase. On the floor today, we have proposals to address whether terrorists should be allowed to purchase guns. Make no mistake, Mr. President, gun control won't stop terrorism. However, I think we can all agree that we do not want terrorists to purchase firearms. That, to me, seems, with both of these competing proposals on the floor, that we do have some common ground that terrorists should not be permitted to purchase firearms. Unfortunately, where we find ourselves is our typical political football, though. And I believe we should stop playing political football with something so important. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, I'm going to recommit myself, and I hope everyone in this body will, to do everything we can to defeat ISIS. I also believe that we should recommit ourselves to find out if there are gaps in our intelligence system that need to be addressed, why this investigation was closed, to make sure that the FBI has the tools they need to prevent these attacks. But I also believe we should work together to ensure that terrorists should not be allowed to buy firearms. But we know what's going to happen. We're not going to find a solution by sticking to two measures that failed before, mostly on party lines. So I have been working with Senator Collins, working with Senator Flake, working with Senator Graham, and talking to people on both sides of the aisle about coming together with a compromise that can pass this body and make sure that terrorists are not allowed to buy guns. If you're too dangerous to board a commercial plane, it stands to reason that you shouldn't be able to buy a gun. It's simple as that. And people on both sides of the aisle, I think, agree on that in principle. So why can't we act in good faith and figure out the best way to achieve that goal? This is a gravely serious issue that requires a serious response. And there is a solution here, and I'm committed to finding it. But to find that solution, we have to come together. Instead of having competing proposals that have already mostly failed in this chamber when we took these votes back in December, let's put aside the gamesmanship and come together to get a proposal that will be effective and get a result for the American people. The Senate will be considering two proposals, as I referenced. Both have failed, mostly on party lines. By all accounts, these proposals are likely to fail again, and we will be right back where we started. No safer, no smarter, no more successful in protecting our citizens. There will be more political blame, but we will be no closer to a solution, to a result of something that matters to ensure that we move forward, to ensure that terrorists do not have access to firearms. So I'm here because I want to talk about a better way. During the past week, working together, as I mentioned, with Senator Collins and Flake, Graham, and others, reaching out to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we want to propose legislation that may actually pass the Senate. But to get to that solution, we have to move this debate forward. That's why I will be voting today to advance both options before us in order to provide an opportunity for us to come together with a bipartisan compromise that'll get a result for the American people. This is an opportunity in this debate. If we go forward with this debate to get a result, unfortunately, both bills on the floor aren't the answer. We know that. They both failed before. So I will be continuing to push to get a result. But what we're doing this afternoon with the political exercise we're having is going to be pushing for legislation that both sides know is going to fail. Both Senator Feinstein and Senator Cornyn's options, both are well-intentioned, but each has flaws that I'm concerned about. Senator Feinstein's approach is very broad, and it would include the entire terrorism database, and it could include instances where there have only been a derogatory allegation made about an American that has not been validated. And there are real due process questions about that using the broader list. It is much broader than the phrase no fly, no buy. I think we all understand that, no fly, no buy. But this is much more broader, and it's misleading to call the Feinstein proposal that proposal. If you cannot get on a plane, you shouldn't be able to buy a firearm. But this measure doesn't require the government to show anything other than reasonable belief that you have been engaged in conduct relating to terrorism. and it doesn't necessarily mean that it has been validated. In December, I supported Senator Cornyn's legislation because it was similar to Senator Feinstein's legislation, but it had additional stronger due process protections. However, Senator Cornyn's legislation requires the FBI to act in 72 hours, to go to a court within 72 hours to present probable cause. Having been a former murder prosecutor myself, I'm concerned that's not enough time under these circumstances to take proper action and to be able to mount all of that before a court to meet a probable cause standard. So I think that there are some concerns that I have in terms of the timing with Senator Cornyn's legislation, and also the fact that if you had probable cause, you probably would have charged someone with a crime already. So there is a better way, Mr. President, and what we have come together on, these two pieces of legislation that I'll be moving both to the debate forward, they're a start, but they're not an end. They're not an end until we get a common sense result that ensure terrorists can't buy guns, but that we protect the due process rights of American citizens. And so our proposal is one that would ensure that if you are on the no-fly list, which, by the way, roughly 800 Americans are on the no-fly list, that would ensure that you could not go and purchase a firearm. But if you believe you're being wrongfully denied, you're right. You can challenge that in court, and if the government is wrong, then they're going to have to pay your costs and attorney's fees. Our legislation would also ensure that individuals like the horrible terrorists that committed these attacks in Orlando that are on a smaller sublist called the Selectee list. This is a list that is smaller than the overall terror watch list. There must be reasonable suspicion that an individual meets additional heightened criteria where they've got additional derogatory information above and beyond the criteria required for the broader database that someone is engaged in terrorism. The Orlando terrorists who committed these horrific attacks was on this list. That group of individuals, too, would not be permitted to purchase a firearm. But they, too, would have the opportunity to go to court and to challenge that decision, and if the government is wrong, to make sure that their costs are paid for. Our proposal would also ensure that if you've been on this list for the last 5 years, that the FBI would be notified if you went to purchase a firearm. Why is that important? Because unfortunately, the terrorist who committed these horrible attacks was taken off the list. We better find out why that happened, but we will make sure on this legislation that if you were on the list, you go to purchase a firearm, that at least the FBI is notified so they could follow up. And if they wanted to conduct additional investigation and surveillance, like I hope they would have done in this instance had they learned about this individual, that they have the opportunity to do that. We believe this is a fair, workable solution. It is a solution that makes sense. It is a solution when we think about the overall terror database has about 1 million people on it. The no-fly list has about 800 Americans. And if you combine the selectee list and the no-fly list, we're talking about less than 2,500 Americans. To make sure that if you're on that list and you're being focused on in an open investigation by the FBI with belief that you are engaged in terrorism or engaged with terrorists, that you should not be able to buy a firearm. Mr. President, we have a responsibility to protect people's constitutional rights. We need to make sure that there is due process for anything that we do here. That is our basic responsibility. That's why our legislation makes sure that terrorists can't buy guns, and it also makes sure that the due process rights of Americans are protected. And if the government's wrong, their costs and attorney's fees will be paid for, because the government should have that burden. It is my hope that, as I suspect that these two proposals may fail tonight, not because of anything I'll do, because I'm going to be asking to get to this debate, because I want a result, Mr. President. I think we should stop playing political football with this, and I would ask members of this body, if these two proposals fail tonight, which I unfortunately think is likely to happen since it's almost Groundhog Day again, since they're similar to two proposals we voted on in December, and we know what the result is, they both failed. I hope we can come together, and I've talked about a good faith, workable solution tonight that makes sense, and I hope that on both sides of the aisle we can work together to get a result for the American people and make sure that we get something done to ensure terrorists cannot purchase firearms. But, Mr. President, let's also make sure that we continue to go after ISIS and defeat ISIS so they cannot inspire further attacks like this on our country. Mr. President, let's also make sure that if there are gaps in our intelligence system because the FBI didn't follow up or should have followed up, or they need more resources to follow these cases to their end, that we work together to address that as well, because this was a horrific, horrific act of terrorism, and we need to treat it accordingly. And it is my hope that we can work together on bipartisan solutions that will help keep the American people safe. Thank you.